Welcome to Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond with Colette Luckie and Dr. Heather Sanders, where they answer the elusive question, why is cultural competence critical in today's multicultural environment, and what are the measurable outcomes and benefits of sustainable allyship? Ready to become aware of, address, and eventually break our cultural biases? Well, let's get into the show.
Okay, here we are. I am Colette Luckie, and this episode is going to focus on the post-election reaction to the final results. Dr. Heather and I, previous to the election, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before, recorded a session of what we imagined and hoped and thought would happen with the appointment of Kamala Harris as our new president. Obviously, that did not take place. So this session episode will just be a discourse on what now, what's next. And I think maybe we start off with our post-election emotions. So Heather, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Dr. Heather Sanders, and I am co-host of the Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond podcast. So excited to be here virtually with you all. Yeah. Um, hmm. I immediately go back to that raw enthusiasm that we had when we were recording together. And I remember trying to temper my enthusiasm. And I remember I said, well, we don't know if she's going to win. And you said, oh, no, she's going to. And I think 99% of me believed you. And I just can't tell you how completely and utterly devastated I was that Wednesday morning when we woke up. Because you remember they didn't tell us that night. They said you'll probably see the results on Wednesday, but we saw it sort of going downhill for VP Harris on Tuesday night. And yeah, I was just utterly devastated. And I'll admit I was a little shocked. A lot of people, you hear them say, oh, I knew they weren't gonna let a black woman become president. I honestly did not see this coming, and I certainly didn't see the landslide. What about you, Colette?
Well, absolutely. Me being either the eternal optimist or the eternal pessimist, I decided to go the optimist route on that one. And really, when I think back to my mindset, and I'm glad we're having this conversation now, because it's probably taken me, this month to actually just formulate in a non-emotional way, the results, my reaction, and things of that nature. Because I'll be honest with you, it was like being thrown naked into an ice plunge in the middle of the Arctic, right? I was,
Wow.
I was, very shocked, upset, and then became shocked. The secondary portion of it was, why did I even allow myself to be in a positive frame of mind, knowing the work we do and how difficult it is often, to get just one or two people to transform their way of thinking. And now the hope was that not an entire nation, but the majority of a nation, a large portion of the population, would see this as a move forward, not only for, underrepresented communities, but for the nation at large. So yes, it affected me emotionally, psychologically, spiritually,
Yeah.
almost every aspect. And the reality is that we are living in a nation of, I'm just going to be honest, very low informed voters who aren't necessarily cognizant of economic, social, or geopolitical ramifications of their voting power. So,
Right.
yeah, if the race was legit. And I'm going to say that it is and take that high road, although I know in my heart, if it had gone in the other direction, there'd be all kind of conspiracy theories of, oh, it was rigged, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm going to take the high road. This was an election, but also the story that that tells me is that a significant portion of the population is operating on a very misogynistic, racist, ideology mindset, where character and integrity and values are pretty low, if non-existing. So,
Yeah. Yes.
that's, just sort of my, 1 month after, I crawled out of the Arctic plunge, I dried off, kind of, trying to warm myself up to see, okay, now what's next? And there is a next. This is not the end of the story. I mean, we've come through slavery, we've come through Reconstruction, we've come through, Jim Crow. Maybe we're in the new Jim Crow right now, but we've come through a lot and gone through a lot, and each time we've come back stronger, right?
Yeah.
So I think this setback could actually be a setup, and I'll leave it for now.
And before, we dive deeply into solution finding and shifting from our more human selves to our practitioner selves, I just want to share, because you named off all of the ways that it impacted you, and I don't know if I heard you say physically, but I just want to add the physical impact that it had on me. Um, Number one, it wasn't intentional, but I was really glad I didn't have in-person meetings that day, or meetings period, where I had to perform and be um professional.
Mhm.
But I remember Wednesday morning waking up, and I told you how devastated I was, but I was bawling. I was bawling, crying. And I had a pit in my stomach and a huge lump in my throat. And those are really painful.
Yes.
And um my kids all had different reactions, but my oldest daughter in particular, who's really civic minded and really into politics, and I'm so proud of her because she thinks a lot about this, and she so wishes she could vote. And in 4 years,
Yeah.
election day is on her birthday, so she'll get to vote on her 18th birthday. So she's really excited about it. She already knows that, and she's like ready. But
Mhm.
anyway, I was just sobbing in bed, and Brian, Colette, is my husband. He was just rubbing my back and rubbing my head, and he gave me a hug and this really great pep talk. And then he gave the girls the same pep talk,
Good.
and he talked about how no matter what happens in this country, our family will always be good. And I don't know what this is called, but at the same time that I appreciated it, I thought about all of the Black women in particular, because 9 times out of 10, literally statistically, 9 times out of 10, a Black woman voted for Kamala, right? So they're disappointed. They're in the world and navigating this reality, right? And I just hoped for them that they had somebody in their life to say, no matter what, you're going to be all right. You're
Yes.
covered. You're good.
Right.
I know you're disappointed, but you're okay. And so that's what I thought about. And I really appreciate that connection to the emotions that I felt. And
Mhm.
he was upset and disappointed and all that, but there's something different about us. We see ourselves in her. Again, like you said, we allowed ourselves to be optimistic and to buy into that idea. And yeah, it's something to be mourned for sure. We're in grieving.
Absolutely, absolutely. And obviously, they say there are stages to mourning and to grief. I think we've probably gone through the first and second stage, but there are other stages that we need to prepare ourselves for because January 20th is coming. all things, being equal, it will be, maybe the third stage of grief, and then living through what, this actually means relative to education, legislation,
Right.
um, private industry, healthcare, immigration,
Mm.
right? I mean, obviously, during his first term, he issued, an executive order, that was later rescinded, but to restrict federal agencies and contractors from conducting certain types of diversity training and programming and mentorship programs, particularly those addressing systemic racism and implicit bias. So, something similar is probably on the horizon. So what are we going to do? How are we going support the civil rights local offices, regional offices, because there may be reduced funding, right? Or less enforcement of authority for monitoring, discrimination cases. So we know that, there are going to be ripple effects if, the rhetoric, if some action follows the rhetoric,
Yeah.
right? Even in the private sector, which, you and I work a lot in the private sector,
Yeah.
but, the tag kind of wags the dog, right? There may be businesses that decide to pull back on certain programs, which will affect, not only you and I economically, but, uh, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and families, across
Yes.
the nation and the world, and not only the economics, but again, the social politic of
Yeah.
what we are trying to do to have more equity, in society, and, to kind of push back against some of the potential, deregulation efforts and rollbacks that may happen. So,
Mm.
I think we have our work cut out for us on a different level. I think,
Yes.
previous to the results, it was like, wow, we're going to leverage, education and affirmative action, and, create policies that are even stronger and more sustainable. Make sure that there are more student protections, in terms of Title IX protections and guidance around that. And now, it's hard enough. That work is hard enough as it is. And now we have, sort of this enemy, right, that is really fighting not to protect some of these very, very valuable to all of society, premises. So, yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us. If we thought it was going to be all Mai Tais, stretching out and kind of relaxing a bit. Not that I expected Kamala to be like the second coming of Christ, and oh, I mean, everything is just going to, be the total opposite. Like a lot of people had that unrealistic expectation of the Obama, administration. You can only do so much. But I'll take that so much, because each of those so much kind of activities is a great step, right? It's all a stepping stone. So
Yeah.
disappointed, but I'm in recovery,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
and not to allow this to destroy all of the work we have done, that our
Mm.
predecessors have done, that our mentors have done, that our ancestors have done. We can't shrink, right?
Right.
No choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think again, as equity workers, right? I'll just kind of sum up what we do and say that it's important for us after we give ourselves space, even as we enter into re-strategizing, restructuring, reframing our work, to really remind ourselves of how we got here. Why is this the reality? And I think one of the things that I started doing after the few days after the election results came out was dive deeply into um, media that covered, some articles, and then also a couple of documentaries that talked about basically the psychology of power and how people justify aligning themselves with leaders that they know are corrupt, right? Because you and I, like, we're thinking logically, right? And we're thinking, how could you vote for somebody who is a felon, is a sex offender, is, doesn't pay taxes, cheats, lies, all these things. And
Bankrupts companies.
exactly, exactly. And who many psychologists have from afar diagnosed him as a malignant narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
And a malignant narcissist is far beyond a regular narcissist.
Right. Your everyday, yeah, tried and true. Right.
Right, right. There's a sort of sadistic nature about him that, again, many psychologists believe to be a real true diagnosis for Donald Trump. And the psychology of power really helps us understand and put into context how people will get behind somebody like that if they feel like their self or group preservation is at risk.
Absolutely. And what I label that as is, it's sociopathy in mass, right?
Okay, and so there's an actual term for it, collective narcissism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, some people and a lot of people really view equity as oppression, right? Um,
I'm sorry, it's not funny,
no,
but it is funny, right? It's just
it's so,
so
yeah, it's so
laughable.
ironic, right? However, those very same people want to oppress and overpower others, right? And they're not accustomed to having that feeling. And so if you've gone centuries and centuries with not having to experience or fight, society at large, then yes, I'd say there, I'll take anything. I will take a sadist. I will take a sociopath. I will
Yes,
take a felon. I will take a sex whatever, anything, but have to really deal with reality and stand on my
yes.
2 feet, right? And
Yeah,
and not have, the entitlements that have been generational entitlements.
yeah,
So I could almost understand the depth of it looking back now at what these people have to lose. They are fighting for their lives, for their very lives, for the first time in history.
right. And they are also, I would add, in what I see is fighting for their superiority.
Correct.
Because fighting for their lives, I think, is something really imagined. It's not real, right? Like their lives are not at
Yeah.
stake,
Right,
but
right.
they are fighting for their sense of superiority. And what's interesting to me is these are the same people that will deny that systems of oppression exist. Well, if they don't exist, what are you fighting for?
Right,
You're
exactly.
fighting to be on the top of the food chain. Let's just be clear about that, right? So, yeah,
Yeah,
very, very interesting.
I mean, I don't know if they would survive. I mean, would they have survived what we have gone through physically, emotionally, economically? I think to a certain extent, they are fighting. They believe they will die. And who knows, maybe they would. Maybe they know they'd be extinct.
That's
I have no
interesting.
idea. I have no idea. But I think their reality is we would not be able to manage, would not be able to survive this on some level. And
Yeah.
so they've done those studies where you ask, okay, what do you think would happen if all of a sudden you were a person of color? And they're like, oh my God, that would be the worst thing for me.
Yes.
Perpetual
Right.
of not wanting to be in that experience yet, as you're stating, wanting to maintain their level of entitlement
Yeah.
and to me, the ultimate affirmative action is what they practiced for decades, right?
Yes.
Centuries. they have lived by an affirmative action ideology, right? Even
Yes.
though they have been the power structure, but I don't know. It's just, it's amazing, but it's also eye-opening to understand how far we're not.
Yes.
And I think that was the ice plunge for me. I really had thought and hoped and maybe dreamed that society was a little bit more progressed than they
Well,
act.
it makes sense that you would believe that because we work with microcosms of those societies. We're in organizations and people come to us and say, oh my gosh, that workshop was life changing, or the coaching that we've engaged in has really shifted my worldview. And so when you're surrounded by that type of feedback and the positive reception to the work, you do start to feel like, wow, maybe what we're doing is making a significant difference, even if just in someone's home or their office or department. And and then though, I'll tell you what my sneaky suspicion was is that even the well-meaning people went in that booth and voted against our interests. I'm going to tell you when I became discouraged. Before the election, I think I might have told you this story, but really quickly, I was watching the news. The Tony DeCopel on CBS News was interviewing people in these small towns talking about how they're going to vote. And so an older white gentleman, looked like a sweet old guy, was being interviewed, and he asked him, "What do you think about Trump?" And he said, "Oh, I abhor his tactics. He's disgusting. I mean, just using really strong adjectives." And he said, "But how are you voting?" And he said, "You're not voting for Kamala." He said, "Oh no." He said, "The other is not an option."
Right. Right.
So I thought right then, I said, "Oh, we're in trouble," because again, people who admit that he is not a leadership figure, right, are saying that Kamala is just and never was an option. And the arguments around being qualified and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was obnoxious. I mean, a lot of oh, it's the lesser of two evils. And then, when I press people to say that, what is the lesser? One of the things, oh, unqualified. I'm like, oh my God, this woman has spent 4 years, first of all, previous to being vice president, a stellar career.
Yes.
Aspects of, government, legal, social, whatever. She's, just been out there for what, 20, 25 years. But then
Yes.
our whole system is based on succession planning. This woman, she's been 4 years. More concerned when we have a nominee for president that hasn't been, a vice president, because I feel like, wow, that's just such a great training ground.
Of
So
course.
had nothing to do with qualifications. It had everything and then some to do with gender and race.
Yes.
I would
Yes.
say maybe even race before gender, right?
And do you think that identity also was more at the helm than even the issues that each party focused on?
Absolutely.
Because a lot of people keep saying, well, she didn't say enough about immigration or she didn't say enough about the economy. And I'm thinking, but I did hear several things about both issues from the Democratic Party.
Of course, of course. So I do not think it was that. I think it was all the top line stuff that, most, people who don't want, people of color to prevail in this country. I think, he spoke a lot about immigration and, obviously, some of those policies, I'm wondering, is that just rhetoric? I mean, he never built the wall. He never, locked her up. So is any of this going to happen? I think a lot of it was just manipulating racism for the vote.
Yeah.
I don't think I think there will be some restriction on policies and travel bans and, work visas. So obviously, there's going to be some, impact for that in terms of talent pools that are reliant, on international workers. But I'm not sure. Is he going to, just get rid of all the immigrants that are in the United States? I mean, the man is a pretty prodigious, liar, storyteller. I'll just say storyteller. So
Yeah.
I think that some of what we're concerned about, we have the right to be concerned about, and I think it's
Sure.
reality. But I also think a lot of the rhetoric, it was a rhetoric voting marketing campaign tapped into racism, tapped into misogyny, right? And that was just to get the vote and to be in that seat of power.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Power. So yeah,
Right.
long term, I think there will be long term, short term judiciary, implications in terms of some of the court appointed judges and some of their conservative stances. But yeah, I think that we shouldn't be deterred and also
Yes.
threatened by a lot of the rhetoric that was used just to get the vote.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think what
Yes.
we do need to be very, aware of is our policies and practices that may limit voting access in the midterm as well as the next. So I think there are going to be stricter voter laws that could disproportionately impact certain groups, marginalized communities in particular. So yeah, I think, if I were to say where maybe the focus should be is making sure that there still is, democratic structure around voting and voting rights and, those types, voting equity, you know,
Yes.
right. Because we don't want a repeat of this.
Yeah, and in terms of like our work, what are some of the key points that you'd like for folks to know
Yeah.
that will inform our work moving forward?
Well, I think, one of the things I started doing was just kind of creating a list, not only a client list, more or less, and a potential client list of, clients who have truly demonstrated allyship, not just programmatic, right? But
Yeah.
said, hey, we really want you to come in and change the culture, the tone, right?
Yeah.
This organization, and make it a national conversation, but also one that fits inside the brand of the company itself. So I think really focusing on helping those clients to sustain and evolve, what they've already planted. Because a lot of them are feeling like we're feeling, wow, disappointed. What's going to happen? Is there going to be litigation? If we move forward with some of this activism and advocacy, how are we going to fight some of these restrictive policies? It costs money to to fight, legally for some of those things. So I think as, practitioners, I think we get behind the true allies that we have relationships with, and then others who may be like kind of fearful or, on the border of pardon the pun, but on, kind of on the border of, okay, should we go forward or not? Or maybe we should pause, just really taking our time, being patient with them,
Yeah.
really helping them to see the long term. Um,
Right. And
um,
many of our clients are afraid of being targets too. A lot of them, particularly I have nonprofit clients, you have nonprofit clients who get federal grants and things like that, and they don't want to be targets. So
Correct.
it's some for some of them, you're right, they're allies and they have no desire to stop the work, but they also have an organization to think about and they don't want to lose significant funding. And so from my standpoint, one of my um, strategies is to, um, along with what you said, is really putting in effort where um, the effort is really sought after and longed for, but to really create structures that embed the principles, that are so under attack in every single organizational practice, policy, that sort of thing. So, for example, um, rather than calling it DEI because it's so
Yeah, it's sort of like
polarizing,
it's a
right?
lightning rod at this point.
Yes. How do we create, you know, fair hiring practices,
Hmm.
right? That's something that we've always done,
Right.
but now we're
Right.
embedding those same principles and just helping organizations
Yeah.
create fair hiring processes and structures, right? How
Right.
do we, help ensure that their policies are, not using language that, could potentially um,
Yeah.
and unintentionally exclude, certain groups,
Right.
right? Well, that's just again fair policy development, right? So I'm really hoping that people understand that these values, diversity, equity, and inclusion, access, belonging, justice, all of those are really a part of a larger picture to make sure that the population of employees, staff, vendors, consultants, the community of that organization is cared for responsively
Right.
and responsibly.
Right.
So I don't know that anybody could necessarily fight or argue with that. I'm sure down the line they can figure out how, but
Right.
really,
They're
this
all they're
is about
the very breath, right?
exactly. But really, this is about creating spaces, workspaces, learning spaces, and in some instances, even living spaces. I have an amazing client who does um, who is a family shelter for
Mhm.
homeless families in their city. And so I want to make sure that those spaces, I want to help clients create an environment where people feel truly cared for, holistically valued and prioritized. And not one time did I say DEI in that.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's definitely possible. Matter of fact, someone sent me a link to a think tank. They are coming up with, other terminology that
Sure.
doesn't use DEI, but basically, it's really going after the same thing. And I think we need to also like be realistic. There are companies, corporations who are not taking this sitting down because they have enjoyed the benefit of
Oh, absolutely.
equity and inclusion relative to the marketplace, right? And they
Yes.
and things of that nature. So, eventually, at the end of we do live in a capitalist society.
That's right.
So
That's
ultimately, money will prevail. So again, I
yeah.
think that the profit margin, no one's going to want to give that up for the sake of some of this other exclusionary conversation and actions or programs
Right.
coming down the pike. So I think there will be some other people fighting, even if it's not for altruistic reasons. I'll take it. Right, but
Absolutely.
necessary.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not going to discriminate about why they're fighting for it, even if it's not for, the reason that we are relative to, creating, not race neutral, but just, a society where everyone is recognized and treated fairly. And yeah, and that's a big charge, but we're still up for the fight. And I think there are clients and potential clients that will be as well. I'll be honest with you. At the point that there was COVID, right? And that march where everything kind of shut down. The last thing I suspected is that business would increase, right?
Yes.
At that
Yes.
time, March, April, May. But by the time that George Floyd event happened, the confluence of COVID and people being stuck without any distractions, and then being able to see some of the injustices that were going on in society, it really bolstered. Think about how that bolstered, the work that we do, right?
Absolutely.
I no longer am of the mindset that because there's been sort of like a big enemy that's, in charge, that it doesn't mean that the work will diminish, that the work will be, you know, will evaporate, right?
Yes.
I just think that it's probably time for us to evolve how we do the work to another level and
Absolutely.
using more innovation and being more stealth about it and that type of thing. But yeah, I mean, as long as, people are alive, diversity, equity, and inclusion will be alive because humans are not
Yeah.
going to allow, that to fall by the wayside. And yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm not.
And I want to give an example before we go really quickly of, your point towards capitalism and that many companies have come such a long way
Yes.
since 2020. One of those companies that I want to point out, and feel free to challenge me, Colette or anybody in the comments, whatever, but um, one of those companies is the NFL.
Mm.
And this goes far beyond who's doing the halftime show. Like, that's cool, but that's not sustainable change,
Right.
right? Having several uh groups or bands or performers of color at the Super Bowl halftime show or singing the national anthem and doing that sort of thing. That's what you would refer to as on stage. We're talking about what's happening behind the stage, right?
Right.
And one of the things that a lot of people just weren't aware of, but there are so many race-based policies in the NFL. One of them just ended at the end of 2021, where I don't know if you're familiar, but there was this race-based dementia test that gave, in like a rubric, right, or some sort of algorithm as to how much a former player could get for brain damage based on their race. So that if they were Black, they weren't worth as much because their cognitive ability wasn't as valuable as a white player.
Mm. That's amazing.
And so they finally changed it in 2021, the year of our Lord, 2021.
Yeah.
So that is significant change. And so not only does it take for us to be still and for us to be strategic and all of those things, it also takes us being courageous and
Right.
saying, we love that you asked Beyonce. We love that you asked Kendrick Lamar. But now we need you to look at these policies that will really impact, a group in significant ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I totally, and even though I enjoy the halftime shows and the
Yeah.
entertainment, but once again, on a certain level, I see that as, you're kind of pitting us, okay, that's where you belong. You need to be entertaining us, right?
Yes.
In terms of making decisions, management decisions, and all of the background that goes into producing, even producing the show, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, let's start even there. But yes, absolutely, policies and structures and protocols, all of that, needs to happen. And I think that I should not and will not be surprised at this point that some of those discriminatory practices and ideologies, they still exist. I think a lot of them we just don't know about, right?
That's right.
That's
Right. On purpose.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is incumbent upon us to stay well read, stay up on
Yeah.
what these organizations are doing, how they're handling, and also to acknowledge and praise the ones that are
Yes.
interested in furthering, cultural competence and minimizing and eliminating bias, and are really doing, what they can to be the change, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. So with that, I think, we're probably at the end of time. Our producer's probably flagging us somewhere, but we're not watching. But I would just say, let's not let DEI die, even though it may be, termed something else, but the work behind it and the philosophy behind it must live on and will live on.
Absolutely. Stronger, deeper, wider, all of it. And, I just want to say as a point of clarity, and then you can take us away for good. I want to be clear because we've used the pronoun they quite a bit, and I want to be really clear. And I feel the liberty to say this on behalf of Colette and I. They is not white people. They are, when we talk about, um, folks who are afraid of the future and afraid of their survival and all of that. We're talking about folks who subscribe to white supremacy ideology,
Yes.
not white people. That's not, what this show is about. So I
Right.
just wanted to be really clear about who the they is, so
Thank you.
nobody has to question that.
Yeah, that's, a good point of clarification, because there are people of color who voted for.
Of course. Absolutely. And we need to talk about that one day.
That's another program
Yeah,
around
it is.
what the premise and why. Maybe that program is just why. Maybe that's
Why?
right. Okay, very good. Well, thank you. It's always, a pleasure to come on, and I hope that, our listeners are gaining some insight and also will share their insight with us via any of our social media platforms. So please subscribe.
Yeah.
Subscribe, and certainly, follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. And certainly we'd love to hear your impressions around things that were said on this program. Whether you are in agreement or not agreement, we love to hear other responses and other voices. So I welcome you to that. And with that, we will sign off for today.